For anyone who's not familiar with me, I'm an environmental scientist and marine biologist. I volunteer with a local wildlife rehabilitation center in Miami where I live. I run a small not-for-profit animal rescue that primarily focuses on kitten care. And I hopefully will be providing some information that maybe some of you might know about how eating animals impacts the environment. While studying food systems in university, I quickly learned that animals have no place in a sustainable diet and that exploiting their bodies compromises the very future of this planet. Global food production has doubled in the last 40 years, and to feed the growing demand for animal products, we've created an industrialized system that destroys the environment, our health, and countless animals in the process. Every year, an estimated 60 billion land animals and nearly 3 trillion marine animals are killed for food. And this comes at the expense of our health, the functionality of vital ecosystems, global biodiversity, and has a significant impact on air, water, and soil quality. So tonight I will be discussing primarily the vast impacts caused by eating animals, breeding them into existence, and slaughtering them. I just want to make a little disclaimer that this is not to take away the priority of the oppression that the animals face. I just want to touch on the environmental impacts because I think a lot of amazing speakers have already addressed the ethical issues with eating animals. So hopefully I can just kind of elaborate on this so that maybe you have some more insight into these issues as well. It's really important that we share this information with the general public because a lot of people are still unfamiliar of how much eating these products and these animals does impact everyone, so it's not a personal choice. So let's talk a little bit about climate change. Just a little bit of background information. The Earth's climate has changed throughout history. This is something that's not new. In the last 650,000 years alone, there have been 7 cycles of glacial retreat and advance, with the abrupt end of the last ice age, beginning the modern climate era and the beginning of human civilization. Now, most of these climate changes are attributed to small solar variations, which changes the amount of solar energy that the planet receives. However, the current warming trend is largely related to human activity since the mid-20th century following the Industrial Revolution. Humans have resulted in a drastic spike in greenhouse gas emissions in a very short span of time. And once these greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere, they act as a thermal blanket. So they heat, the Earth heats and the Earth absorbs heat and it warms the planet. So naturally, we have a warm planet because these gases exist. So they do help us sustain life. So they're absolutely essential to life on the planet Earth. However, too many of these gases causes major changes in the global climate. And without them, the planet would be about negative 18 degrees Celsius. I don't think anybody wants to live on a planet like that. So what? So why do we care about global climate change? Well, since the Industrial Revolution, people have helped raise Earth's temperature by an average of 1 degree Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius in the Arctic. The 20 warmest years on record have occurred all within the last 22 years, and even a slight increase in Earth's average temperature can have far-reaching impacts. By the end of the century, the global temperature is likely to raise more than 2 degrees Celsius. Scientists predict that this global increase in temperature will change life on our planet as we know it. Rising seas, mass extinctions, super droughts, increased wildfires, intense hurricanes, decreased crops and fresh water, as well as the melting of the Arctic are expected. The impact on human health will be profound. Rising temperatures and shifts in weather patterns will lead to reduced air quality, food and water contamination, and more infections by insects, as well as a stress on mental health. I don't know about any of you guys, but I don't need any more stress on my mental health. Additionally, the most vulnerable populations in the world are those most at risk of these devastating effects, despite being the least responsible for the damage that we've done to the planet. So how does this all relate to animal agriculture? Well, aside from the ethical dilemma of eating animals, these industries pose massive consequences to the future of this planet. The meat, dairy, and egg industries, as they're coined, are the leading drivers of anthropogenic climate change, or human-caused climate change. The very industries that cause the most pain and suffering to non-human people also contribute more greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere than any other industry in the world. In fact, the most comprehensive analysis ever performed on environmental issues by the World Bank, not some group of tree-hugging hippie vegans, determined that the animal agriculture industries are among the leading drivers of most serious environmental issues that plague the earth. And some of these issues include deforestation, habitat destruction, species extinction, arable land use, air pollution, water pollution, ocean dead zones, and a lot of other daunting and scary things. So the World Bank report titled Livestock's Long Shadow determined that animal agriculture is responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, which, as many of us know, is more than the combined exhaust from all forms of transportation. Cows produce 150 billion gallons of methane per day, contributing upwards of 40% of global methane emissions. Farmed animals also produce 9% of all carbon dioxide emissions and generate 64% of all ammonia emissions, resulting in local air and environmental impacts. Animal agriculture activities contribute 65% of all anthropogenic nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide is one of the least discussed greenhouse gases, but it's the most potent. It has a global warming potential of 310 times that of carbon dioxide. And global warming potential was developed to allow comparisons of global warming effects. It measures how much heat greenhouse gases trap in the atmosphere along a specific horizon of time compared to carbon dioxide. So where do we stand? Are we on the road to recovery? Unfortunately, no. A lot of this presentation might be a little depressing. So I apologize in advance. While veganism has increased substantially in the Western world over the past few years, the number of animals slaughtered for food continues to rise. 2018, more animals were killed than the year before. 2017, the same thing can be said. In fact, more animals are dying every single day than they ever have in history. So how is that possible? Well, the global human population is currently at about 7.6 billion, and it's predicted that by 2030, the population will climb by another billion. With a growing population comes a higher demand for animal products. As the middle class expands in highly populated developing countries like India and China, they will begin to eat more meat, dairy, and egg products. Since the 1970s, meat production has tripled, and just between 2000 and 2010, it's increased by 20%. So let's take a big picture look at these systems to get an idea of just how inefficient they are. And for the sake of this example, I'm going to use chickens, since they're among the most exploited and abused animals. So for any given animal system, we have to grow tons of food for them to sustain them and ultimately get them to slaughter weight. So first we have to convert, let's say, a primary growth forest that was home to native wildlife, provided tons of ecosystem services to people, and we're going to just bulldoze it, right? And then we're going to plant genetically modified soy or corn crops. And we're going to use tons of chemical fertilizers, water, we're going to use genetically modified seed because it's cheapest, it's drought resistant, it's resistant to tons of pesticides. And then when it's ready to be harvested, we're going to mechanically harvest it, and that's what happens in most of these scenarios. So along every step of this way, we're going to see a common theme, and it's going to be fossil fuels. So keep in mind that along each one of these chains, there's going to be fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emissions, so keep in mind the global warming impact that that has. Eventually, the feed is going to be transported to a processing facility, right, because they don't process it at the farm. And then it's going to get shipped to a feed store. Eventually, it's going to be transported to the farm and fed to animals who are bred into existence. Once the animals are born, they're ultimately going to be transported to either a rearing shed, depending on the animal and the farm. They could be many stages of this, so we're going to just multiply it by 2 to be safe. And along that process, of course, we are feeding them these genetically modified foods, we are fattening them up artificially, and we're going to dose them with antibiotics and hormones, as well as using tons and tons of water resources. And what do we get out of that besides the flesh that we eat? We're going to get tons of greenhouse gas emissions, feces, urine, and afterbirth, lots of things that are not very palatable. And then ultimately, they're going to be transported to the slaughterhouse. Again, more fossil fuels. If the packaging facility is not associated with the slaughterhouse, they're going to be transported to a packaging facility. They'll eventually be transported to a grocery store, to a consumer household, and if you live in America, where I live, 40% of that animal will end up in a landfill. So does anyone think this is an efficient way to produce food? No, it's not. So they're very inefficient systems, and while animals make up 83% of global farmland, including the feed crops, they only provide about 18% of total calories and 37% of total protein, contrary to popular beliefs that all protein comes from animals. And it's incredibly inefficient and unsustainable. So keep in mind that the most industrialized efficient food systems ever created exist now. So we're looking at the most efficient forms of these systems. And yet they're still yielding incredibly inefficient feed conversion ratios. So for anybody that's not familiar with a feed conversion ratio, it's the amount of feed crops that are invested into an animal to yield a pound or a kilogram of edible flesh. So for a chicken, it takes 9 calories invested into one chicken to yield just 1 calorie of edible flesh. That means that the most efficient source of animal-based protein comes at a cost of 800% food waste at a feed conversion ratio of 9 to 1. And now, like I said, chickens are the most energy efficient. Pigs and cows range between 15 and 25 to 1, respectively. In other words, for every 100 calories of edible chicken, 800 calories of flesh is thrown away by cycling the calories through the individual instead of us directly eating the plants. That means 8 times as much water, land, pesticides, gasoline. You guys get the idea. And chickens are the least climate change-inducing animals, yet they cause 40 times more climate change per calorie of protein than the legumes that would otherwise be turned into plant-based meat. If anyone in here has seen Cowspiracy, you're probably familiar with some of these big picture ideas. And it's true, about 91% of the Amazon is deforested for directly grazing cows or to produce cheap genetically modified soy that's then fed to farmed animals. Every second, 1 to 2 acres of rainforest are cleared to grow feed crops or graze animals in the Amazon and beyond, some of our most biologically diverse ecosystems. So as much as people want to blame tofu-eating vegans for destroying the Amazon, it's not true. 80% of Amazonian soy is actually destined as animal feed. So rainforests are often called the lungs of the planet. They have a huge role in absorbing carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. They stabilize the climate. They are a home to plants and animals, and they produce nourishing rainfall for the entire planet, not just in South America, but far beyond. And these life-sustaining forces are just simply being cut and grazed to grow cheap beef that's sold in places like McDonald's. And this is catastrophic for native wildlife, as well as the people who have been pushed out of their homes. Amazonian tribes, as well as environmental activists, have been killed for refusing to leave their land and fighting against the powerful logging and ranching industries. So 30% of the Earth's land surface that was once inhabited by wildlife is now used for grazing farmed animals. Farmed animals account for 20% of the terrestrial biomass on Earth. That means 1/5 of all animals that exist on Earth are farmed animals: cows, chickens, pigs, camels. You get the idea. So terrestrial ecoregions represent the original distribution of distinct assemblages of species, meaning that they're the most biologically diverse areas and the most unique areas in the world. And 37% of these terrestrial ecoregions in the world are directly threatened by animal agriculture. An analysis of the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species shows that most of the world's threatened species are suffering habitat loss where farmed animals are a major factor. And this is coming from some of the most reputable scientific organizations and panels in the world. So throughout the geological history of Earth, there have been 5 mass extinction events over a span of 450 million years. Mass extinction events occur when global extinction rates rise significantly above background levels in a geologically short period of time. Scientists think that they're typically caused by natural disasters like volcanic eruptions, asteroids, and sea level falls. However, the 6th mass extinction event is largely human-driven and could result in what scientists are calling a biological annihilation of species. In the last 20 years, we've already experienced catastrophic declines in populations of common and rare vertebrate species. Animal agriculture and fishing are the biggest threats to wildlife extinction. It's estimated that we lose up to 50,000 species a year to these industries. Approximately 90% of global fish stocks are referred to as being either fully fished or what's considered overfished. And there should not even be a term, we shouldn't be hunting these animals. But what this means is that they've been removed from the ecosystem at a rate that prevents them from replenishing the population. So from grazers to predators around the world, they're killed on a massive scale to accommodate meat, dairy, and egg industries. As land is cleared for farmed animals and feed crops, native species get pushed out. In addition to direct habitat destruction impacting animals, government-sanctioned wildlife calls to protect special interest groups are common around the world. From wolves to wild horses, we devastate wildlife populations to protect these industries. Farmers are often granted permission to kill wild animals considered a nuisance to their operations, and the removal of top-level predators by hunters and special interest groups has created an ecological imbalance, resulting in trophic cascades. And essentially what a trophic cascade is when you remove these top-level predators, it just trickles down and affects all other animals beneath them in the trophic pyramid. So in Queensland, which produces half of Australia's cow flesh, over 90% of tree clearing in this region is to convert forest to grazing pasture. So 90% of all tree clearing there. And a 2017 report by the World Wildlife Foundation of Australia found that millions of native wildlife are killed each year due to the bulldozing of their forests here and the woodland habitats to accommodate the cattle ranching expansion. It's estimated that in Queensland alone, approximately 34 million native animals, mammals, birds, and reptiles are killed each year to accommodate these industries. And let's talk a little bit about fishing. Unfortunately, marine animals aren't spoken about nearly enough. However, they are the most exploited in the world. The slaughter of target and non-target marine animals is on track to leave us with ecologically extinct oceans by 2048. Annually, humans kill about 2.7 trillion fish in the wild or on aquaculture farms. And contrary to popular belief, straws aren't the ocean's #1 enemy. Approximately 700,000 tons of fishing gear are left in the oceans every single year, posing direct threats to many animals that are not intended to be caught, and as well as those that are intended to be caught. Thousands of miles of nets and lines are left in the ocean each day, and this fishing gear is often undetectable and it's incredibly strong. They're efficient killing machines, so many of these animals never see it coming, and then they're just stuck and trapped, and it's a horrible prolonged death, and I've seen it firsthand. Therefore, these devices are very good at killing anything in their path. A staggering amount of wildlife is also caught during the direct catch of these animals, and they're thrown overboard. They're considered bycatch or bykill. For the fishing industry, some are more unsustainable than others in terms of killing other animals. Shrimp, for example, for every 1 kilogram of shrimp that's caught, 15 kilograms of bycatch animals or non-intended animals are discarded and wasted. So here are some of the other forgotten victims of fishing. This is a photo I took at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where I volunteer. At least 60% of all seabirds that we get into our station suffer from direct impacts of fishing and derelict fishing gear. This is a pelican, a juvenile brown pelican under the age of 2 years old. You can see he's suffering from a very significant pouch tear. And this is something that's very common. If you go to any marina or area where fishing occurs, you are destined to see something like this. And oftentimes these animals have hooks throughout their internal organs. It's really, really horrible, and it often is fatal, especially when people like us can't step in and help them. Annually, millions of whales, dolphins, sea turtles, fish, and seabirds are killed by recreational and commercial fishing efforts. So a lot of times you'll see a lot of these charismatic animals like turtles and whales that people care about and hold dearly, but other animals that we don't think of also suffer immensely. Over 27 million metric tons of wildlife are caught and discarded in the commercial fishing industry each year. It also impacts coral reefs, mangroves, and poses many threats to animals in their path. And you can see a little bit of a happy story, because of depressing everyone. This is the pouch tear after we stitched him up, sutured him, and in about a month or 2 months, he was released back into the wild. So that's a little bit of a happy story. And that does happen from occasion. So aquaculture farms, perhaps some people are unfamiliar with them. They provide over 50% of all fish that meets the market today, and 25% of all aquaculture raised fish are actually fed to farmed animals, pigs, etc. So aquaculture in Australia is actually the country's fastest growing primary industry, accounting for 34% of the total gross value of production of seafood. And it's set to double within the next 15 years. Open water systems such as these put wild fish populations at risk of infection and disease, and it's also common for farm fish to escape these open water pens, competing with other animals for resources and contaminating the local gene pool. And we can't afford this to happen because, as you know, we've already been placing so many direct threats to the animals that are in the wild. And most industrially farmed fish are carnivorous, therefore it requires feeding them smaller fish. They can't just live off of oxygen. So we are actually wiping out smaller forage fish, such as herring, anchovy, and krill now, to feed these animals. In response to a shortage of these animals, because we are literally taking them out of the food web, manufacturers have started producing genetically modified feed like corn, soy, and algae, which is also very environmentally destructive. And these farms are essentially just floating there, similar to how any land-based agriculture system would work. So any of the inputs, as well as the outputs, feces, are entering these open water systems and having very severe ecological impacts, as well as entangling wildlife. Oh, sorry. So if you're someone who's conscious of your water footprint, it might surprise you to learn that one cheeseburger requires the same amount of water as 6 months worth of showers, or 6 months worth of toilet flushes, or 3 months worth of showers. For the sake of the animals, your personal hygiene, and the planet, please skip the burgers. 1 kilogram of chicken requires 71% more water resources than a kilogram of soy. And the projected increase in the production and consumption of animal products is likely to further put a strain on our global freshwater resources. Currently, the water used to grow feed crops, and that's directly consumed by animals, accounts for 1/3 of all global freshwater use. Around the world, 3 in 10, or 2.1 billion people, lack access to safe drinking water at home. And the world's largest freshwater aquifers are being depleted at an alarming rate, with agriculture as the main use of this resource. At the same time, these systems are polluting many of our freshwater resources. So throughout many parts of the world, we've already seen changes in weather patterns, including changes in the severity or frequency of extreme events, including storms, floods, and droughts. Last year in Australia, warmer and drier winters resulted in New South Wales experiencing the driest year since 1965. Further compounding the issues in the industry's huge consumption of water, coupled with extensive land modification. 56% of the Australian continent is used for grazing or feed pastures. Only about 3.5% of land is used to grow plant foods for humans. Plant cover and healthy root systems result in better infiltration of moisture in the soil. So land conversion and overgrazing can cause drought-like conditions even with average precipitation, thereby intensifying the drought impacts during hot, dry climates. So as we continue to deplete these resources, we're going to be feeling longer lasting and more severe droughts, which I know a lot of people have probably felt firsthand here. So in 2018, farmers struggled to provide feed and water to their animals, resulting in the grueling and prolonged death of millions of animals throughout Australia. These industries continue to strain natural resources while taking massive bailouts from taxpayers, government entities, and nonprofits. Since last year, Australians have donated $50 million to drought relief for farmers, while the government provided billions of dollars in subsidies. The animal agriculture industry is by far the single largest anthropogenic user of land. So 30% of all land, 30% of all land on Earth is occupied by either grazing animals or to grow feed crops to feed the animals. And in total, animal systems account for 70% of all agricultural land. Nearly 40% of the world grain is being fed to the animals rather than directly being consumed by humans. And in the United States alone, we produce enough food for 800 million people, and there are 795 million people currently starving throughout the world. So air pollution. Animal feces and urine emits about 400 different harmful gases into the atmosphere, including nitrous oxide, ammonia, particulate matter, endotoxins, and hydrogen sulfide. Confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs as they're referred to, have far-reaching impacts on human health and surrounding communities, especially minority communities which tend to surround these facilities. They result in brain development issues in children, neurological inflammation, damages to the nervous system, respiratory issues. They increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, can damage your reproductive system, cause birth defects, and increase your risk of diabetes. Acid rain that's caused by high levels of ammonia in the local environment. It's caused by bacteria that proliferates and combines with other pollutants. It forms nitric acid, which basically accumulates in the atmosphere, and then it returns to the surface as acid rain, which harms the soil, forest habitats, as well as freshwater ecosystems. So these systems obviously also directly change the hydrological structure of the environment. This is a look at how we've changed things in my home state of Florida back in the United States. We had a natural system of drainage that went out into the bay. You can see down south here is Miami. We have a beautiful ecosystem, the Everglades, which maybe some of you are familiar with. And since we've altered it to accommodate farming, we've seen huge issues with algal blooms. We've had dry seasons that should have water flowing through the area. It's very detrimental to the local environment. And grazing increases this by basically contributing to sedimentation, which reduces the water quality and impairs the local aquatic systems as well. Cattle ranching operations in Australia are responsible for 75% of sedimentation, 54% of phosphorus, and 40% of nitrogen in waters surrounding coral reefs. So there's a few different forms of pollution, as you can imagine, from these wonderful systems I've been talking about. So point source pollution is observable. It's specific and confined discharge of pollutants into a body of water. And the animal agriculture sector can be linked to three main point source mechanisms, including feedlots, food processing plants, and agrochemical processing plants.